The baby's breathing had grown so shallow that Sarah could barely see his tiny chest rise and fall. Old Eagle's weathered hands moved over her son's burning body as ancient Lakota chants filled the candlelit room. Outside, the town doctor who had refused to help paced angrily, his reputation hanging in the balance as dawn approached. Sarah Mackenzie pressed her palm against her baby's forehead and felt her stomach drop. The fever was getting worse. At 26, she'd already buried a husband and learned to read the signs of trouble. This wasn't ordinary fussiness. Thomas, barely 3 months old, lay listless in her arms while his tiny body burned like a coal from the fireplace. The October wind rattled the windows of their small cabin on the edge of Cedar Falls. 6 months had passed since the logging accident took her husband James, and Sarah had grown accustomed to handling crises alone. But this was different. Her maternal instinct screamed danger as Thomas's breathing grew shallow and rapid. She wrapped the baby in his warmest blanket and stepped into the muddy streets. The town doctor would know what to do. Dr. Harrison Whitmore had trained back east, and folks said he could cure anything that ailed you. Sarah's boots splashed through puddles as she hurried toward his office, clutching Thomas against her chest. The doctor's office sat above the general store, yellow light spilling from its windows. Sarah climbed the wooden stairs 2 at a time. Her heart hammered as she knocked on the door, then pushed inside without waiting. Dr. Whitmore looked up from his desk, annoyed. He was a man in his 50s with graying hair and wire-rimmed spectacles that made his eyes look smaller than they were. His medical diploma hung framed on the wall behind him, a constant reminder of his superiority over the frontier folk he served. "My baby," Sarah gasped, still catching her breath. "Something's wrong. The fever won't break." The doctor's expression shifted when he recognized her. Everyone in Cedar Falls knew Sarah Mackenzie, the widow with the half-breed child, the woman who didn't quite fit anywhere. Whitmore stood slowly, his professional demeanor cooling several degrees. He glanced at the baby with the same enthusiasm he might show a week-old fish. Thomas whimpered weakly, his face flushed red with fever. "Let me see," Whitmore said, but his examination lasted maybe 30 seconds. He barely touched the child. Instead, he seemed more concerned with maintaining his distance than providing actual care. Sarah watched his face, searching for some sign of medical concern or urgency. She found none. The doctor straightened up, already dismissing them before he'd even spoken. "The child appears to have a simple fever," Whitmore announced, as if he were commenting on the weather. "These things run their course. Bring him back in a few days if it persists." Sarah stared at him. "A few days? Doctor, please, look at him again. Something's not Eastgoolwold right." Whitmore's jaw tightened. He adjusted his spectacles and looked at Sarah with the kind of cold patience reserved for people he considered beneath his station. "Mrs. Mackenzie, I've examined dozens of children with similar symptoms. This is hardly an emergency." The words hit her like a slap. Thomas's labored breathing filled the silence between them. Sarah's desperation bubbled to the surface. "Please," she whispered, "he's all I have left." But Whitmore had already turned back to his desk. "My time is valuable, Mrs. Mackenzie. I can't waste it on cases that don't warrant serious medical attention." He paused, letting his meaning sink in. "Particularly not for children of mixed heritage." The dismissal was final, complete. Sarah stood there holding her dying son while the town's only doctor essentially showed them the door. Her husband's words echoed in her memory about Old Eagle, the Lakota medicine man who lived in the hills outside town. James had always spoken of the old healer with deep respect, but that meant venturing into the darkness, alone, with a sick baby, and no guarantee of welcome. As Thomas's breathing grew more labored, Sarah realized she had no choice left. The cabin felt smaller when Sarah returned with Thomas burning in her arms. The fever had climbed higher during their brief trip to town, and her son's whimpers had grown weaker. She placed him on their bed and watched his tiny chest struggle with each breath. This wasn't getting better. This was getting worse, fast. Dr. Whitmore's dismissive words echoed in her head. Simple fever. Right. She'd seen simple fevers before. This wasn't one of them. Thomas's skin felt like touching a hot stove, and his eyes had that glassy, distant look that made her stomach twist into knots. She was watching her baby die, and the town's medical establishment had basically told her to come back next week. The clock on the mantel ticked past midnight. Sarah paced the small room, bouncing Thomas gently, trying anything to bring him comfort. Nothing worked. His breathing grew more labored with each passing hour. She'd lost her husband 6 months ago to a falling tree. She wasn't losing her son to a doctor's prejudice. Then there was James's voice in her memory, telling stories about Old Eagle. Her late husband had worked as a translator for the lumber company, spending time with the Lakota families who lived in the hills beyond Cedar Falls. He'd come home with tales of the old medicine man's healing wisdom, describing treatments that seemed impossible but somehow worked. "That old man knows things doctors never learned in their fancy schools," James had said more than once. Seen him cure fevers that would kill a horse, got herbs and methods passed down through generations. But seeking out Old Eagle meant admitting defeat. It meant leaving the safety of town in the dead of night with a sick baby. It meant trusting someone she'd never met with her son's life. Makes sense, right? Trusting a stranger over the qualified physician who just turned them away. Actually, when she thought about it that way, maybe it made perfect sense. Sarah wrapped Thomas in every blanket she owned. The baby barely stirred. His fever had sapped what little strength he had, and his breathing sounded like wind through broken leaves. She grabbed a lantern and stepped into the October darkness. The path to the hills wasn't really a path at all, just a series of game trails and logging roads that wound through dense woods. Sarah had walked these routes with James before, but never alone, never at night, never with a dying child in her arms. Tree branches caught at her skirt. Roots tried to trip her. The lantern cast dancing shadows that made every stump look like a crouching animal. Thomas grew heavier with each step, though that made no sense since he weighed maybe 12 pounds soaking wet. Fear does funny things to your muscles, makes everything harder. Sarah's arms ached, but she pressed on because stopping meant giving up, and giving up meant burying another loved one before winter set in. The weird part is how quiet the forest became as she climbed higher. No owl calls, no rustling leaves, just her footsteps and Thomas's labored breathing creating a rhythm that sounded like a funeral march. Sarah tried not to think about that comparison. An hour into her journey, she smelled wood smoke. Then she saw the glow of a cabin window through the trees. Old Eagle's place sat in a small clearing, looking exactly like James had described it. Simple, weathered, built to last. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from the chimney into the star-filled sky. Sarah approached slowly, her heart hammered against her ribs. What if Old Eagle refused to help? What if he didn't speak English? What if James had exaggerated the old man's abilities? Thomas whimpered in her arms, and she realized those questions didn't matter. This was her last option. She knocked on the wooden door. Old Eagle answered immediately, as if he'd been expecting her. He was smaller than she'd imagined, maybe 70 years old, with silver hair braided down his back and eyes that seemed to hold decades of accumulated wisdom. He looked at Sarah, then at the bundle in her arms, and nodded once. "James Mackenzie's woman," he said in clear English. "I wondered when you would come." Sarah nearly cried with relief. He knew who she was. He'd been expecting her. "My baby," she managed. "He's very sick." Old Eagle stepped aside and gestured her into his cabin. The space was warm and smelled of sage and dried herbs. Bundles of plants hung from the ceiling beams. Clay pots lined wooden shelves. This wasn't some primitive hut. This was a pharmacy that had been operating for generations. "Show me the child," Old Eagle said. Sarah unwrapped Thomas on a blanket near the fireplace. The baby's skin glowed red with fever, and his breathing sounded like paper tearing. Old Eagle knelt beside him and began an examination unlike anything Sarah had witnessed. He didn't just look, he listened. He touched specific points on Thomas's body with fingertips that seemed to read information invisible to everyone else. The old man spoke in Lakota, words Sarah didn't understand but somehow found comforting. His voice carried certainty, purpose. This wasn't guesswork or dismissive glances. This was careful, methodical assessment by someone who actually cared about the outcome. "White man's sickness," Old Eagle finally announced, "but old remedies still work." He moved around his cabin with surprising speed, gathering herbs and powders from various containers. Sarah watched him combine ingredients with the precision of someone following a recipe perfected over decades. He crushed leaves between his palms. He measured powders with small wooden spoons. He muttered instructions to himself in 2 languages. The first remedy was a tea brewed from bark and roots. Old Eagle helped Sarah tip tiny amounts between Thomas's lips. The baby was too weak to protest, which worried her more than fighting would have. The second treatment involved a paste made from crushed herbs, which the old man spread on Thomas's chest and forehead. Then came the part that challenged everything Sarah thought she understood about healing. Old Eagle began to chant, low, rhythmic sounds that seemed to vibrate through the cabin floor. He moved his hands above Thomas's body, in patterns that meant nothing to Sarah, but clearly meant everything to him. She wanted to ask questions. She wanted explanations for methods that seemed so foreign to her experience. But Thomas's breathing had already begun to change. Still labored, but different somehow, more regular. Old Eagle worked through the night with quiet determination. He brewed fresh teas every hour. He replaced herb poultices with new preparations. He continued his chanting, sometimes loud enough to fill the cabin, sometimes whispered like private conversations with spirits Sarah couldn't see. Dawn was approaching when she heard familiar footsteps outside, heavy boots, angry muttering. Dr. Whitmore had apparently heard about her midnight journey through town gossip. This was about to get interesting. The cabin door rattled under Dr. Whitmore's impatient knocking. Sarah looked up from where she knelt beside Thomas, her heart sinking. The last thing she needed was the man who'd abandoned her son showing up to cause trouble. But when Old Eagle opened the door, something had shifted in her baby's breathing, still shallow but steadier somehow. What exactly is going on here? Dr. Whitmore stepped inside without invitation, his medical bag clutched like a weapon. His eyes swept the cabin with obvious disdain, taking in the hanging herbs, the clay pots, the smoky air thick with sage. "Mrs. Mackenzie, I heard you'd brought your child to this person." Old Eagle said nothing, just continued grinding fresh herbs in a wooden bowl, his weathered hands moving with practiced precision. The silence seemed to irritate Whitmore more than any argument would have. Sarah watched the doctor's face as he noticed Thomas lying on the blanket. Her son's fever-flushed skin still radiated heat, but his breathing had definitely improved over the past hour. The desperate, rattling quality was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost normal. "You've endangered this child by bringing him out in the night air," Whitmore announced, dropping to one knee beside the baby. He pulled out his stethoscope with theatrical authority. "Primitive remedies and superstition are no substitute for actual medicine." That's when Old Eagle spoke. His voice carried quiet authority that filled the small cabin. "White man's medicine turned mother and child away. Old ways do not abandon the sick." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Whitmore's face reddened, but not from embarrassment, from anger at being challenged by someone he considered beneath him. "I examined this child properly. The condition wasn't serious enough to warrant immediate intervention." Sarah felt something crack inside her chest. "Not serious enough? Look at him. Really look at him this time." Whitmore placed his stethoscope on Thomas's chest, clearly intending to prove his point. The baby stirred slightly at the cold metal touch. His breathing remained steady. His color had begun improving. Even his temperature felt lower to Sarah's touch. The doctor listened for a long moment. His confident expression wavered. He moved the stethoscope to different positions, checking and rechecking. His frown deepened with each assessment. "The fever is breaking," he said finally, as if announcing weather conditions. Old Eagle nodded. "Child will live. Herbs draw poison from body. Prayers guide healing spirits." He gestured to the various preparations scattered around Thomas. Knowledge passed down through many generations. Whitmore's medical training was clearly wrestling with what he was witnessing. A baby who'd been critically ill hours earlier was now showing clear signs of recovery, treated not with modern medicine, but with methods his education had taught him to dismiss as worthless. "This is coincidence," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The fever would have broken naturally." Sarah stood up slowly, her legs stiff from kneeling beside her son all night. "Would it? Because you told me to wait a few days. You told me it wasn't serious. You basically told me to go home and watch my baby die." The morning light streaming through the cabin window illuminated everything with harsh clarity. Dr. Whitmore's prejudice, Old Eagle's genuine healing knowledge, Thomas's steady breathing, the contrast between dismissive arrogance and compassionate care. Whitmore packed his stethoscope with jerky movements. I'll expect to see the child in my office for proper follow-up care, he said, trying to reclaim some professional authority. No, Sarah said quietly. You had your chance to help us. You chose not to. The doctor's face went through several color changes. His reputation in a small town like Cedar Falls depended on being seen as the only legitimate healer. Having a Lakota medicine man succeed where he'd failed wasn't just embarrassing, it was professionally dangerous. But Thomas was breathing normally now. His fever had clearly broken. His eyes looked brighter, more focused. Old Eagle's methods had worked when modern medicine had turned them away. Dr. Whitmore left without another word, his boots heavy on the cabin floor. Sarah looked down at her son, then at the old medicine man who'd saved his life. Some bridges once built change everything that comes after. Thomas slept peacefully in my arms as we walked back towards Cedar Falls. The fever had completely broken. His breathing stayed steady and strong. After 8 hours of terror, I finally had my son back. Old Eagle walked partway with us, carrying a small pouch of dried herbs. For later, he said, pressing it into my hands. If sickness returns. His weathered face crinkled into something resembling a smile. But it will not return soon. The morning sun painted the forest golden. Birds sang again. Even the air smelled different now that Thomas was safe. Hope has its own fragrance, apparently. We reached the edge of town as people were starting their daily routines. I saw curtains twitch in windows, whispered conversations behind cupped hands. The story of where I'd spent the night would spread through Cedar Falls faster than butter melts on hot bread. Let them talk. Mrs. Patterson from the general store approached hesitantly. She'd always been kind to me, even when others weren't. Sarah, how is the baby? He's well, I said, pulling back the blanket so she could see Thomas's peaceful face. Old Eagle saved his life. Her eyes widened. Mrs. Patterson had lived in Cedar Falls for 30 years. She knew the difference between frontier tall tales and simple truth. The Lakota medicine man? The healer who didn't turn us away. Word traveled fast in small towns. By noon, half the population had found excuses to walk past my cabin. Some came out of genuine concern. Others came for gossip. A few came because they had their own medical problems that Dr. Whitmore had dismissed or couldn't solve. That afternoon, I made an unexpected decision. I wrapped Thomas warmly and walked back up the hill to Old Eagle's cabin. Not because anything was wrong, because something was finally right. I want to learn, I told him simply. The old man studied my face for a long moment. Then he nodded. Knowledge shared grows stronger. Come when you can. Over the following months, I became Old Eagle's student, not to replace Dr. Whitmore, but to offer something he couldn't: compassion, patience, healing that saw people instead of prejudices. Thomas grew strong and healthy. The herb pouch never left my side. And Cedar Falls slowly learned that wisdom doesn't require diplomas. Sometimes the best medicine is simply refusing to give up on people. My son taught me that. So did an old Lakota man who opened his door to strangers in the darkness.